Hey everyone. So in this video, I want to cover the PowerPoint on integrating sources from this week's module. The lesson prior to this one was on how to get started drafting a research paper. And obviously, you know, at some point, whether you use the method of writing freely or writing systematically, at some point, you have to incorporate your source material. And that isn't always an easy thing for a writer. It might be one of the areas that students especially feel the least comfortable. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about, you know, how you can go about integrating your sources more effectively into your writing. Why are we at the end? Why are we at the beginning? Thank you. All right, so how to use source material, integrating sources. So knowing how to effectively incorporate source material is pretty important in a research paper. If you're able, and that doesn't mean just using source material, including it, it means integrating it, making it a natural part of your own thought process, your own ideas and your own words, so that, you know, yes, it's clear that this information came from this specific source, but everything still flows and sounds natural. And that's what we want to strive for. Using the source material and doing it effectively, it helps, you know, bolster your own credibility as a writer. And you want to present that information to your reader just so they have the information as well. You want to make sure that you are providing the information in an effective way. Hopefully you have already chosen, because this should have been a step that you already covered when you were thinking about what sources you wanted to use and what information to pull from each specific source. You hopefully have already made sure that the specific information is relevant and effective. So now let's make sure we know how to incorporate it effectively, right? So there are 3 ways to integrate source material into your paper. The first one is summary. So it is a relatively brief, objective account in your own words of the main ideas of an entire source, or maybe a section of a source. Again, just the main ideas, and objective, meaning you're not incorporating any of your own opinions or thoughts about the source information. You are simply saying, this is what this source is about, or this is what this section of this source is about. So if you're summarizing a whole source, or even just a section of a source, it's going to be a little bit shorter, right? If you're going to summarize a 3-page article, and a summary is only supposed to touch on the overall main ideas, your summary is only going to be a paragraph, probably, right? A paraphrase is where you take a smaller section of source information and you restate it in your own words, right? The structure of the ideas might reflect the original version, but it does not copy. Nothing should look and sound very different than the original. You are literally taking it and putting it into your own words, saying the same thing in a new and different way. Typically, a paraphrase will end up being about the same length as the original source material. Then we also have a quote, a direct quote, which is where you are using the exact words from your source, word for word. Like you could copy and paste it, word for word, into the essay. There's other things you'd have to do. You'd have to put the quotation marks, you have to give the citation, all that good stuff. But just, thinking of what a direct quote means, it means word for word. Now, you will want to summarize and paraphrase most often in your research. Use direct quotes sparingly. Putting source material into your own words shows that you have a true understanding of that material. I can tell you from experience that I have had numerous research papers submitted to me that when I see a direct quote being used, I will look closely at it and really read that paragraph. And there are plenty of times where it's pretty apparent that the student chose to include that direct quote, but honestly didn't really think about what it said, or maybe didn't even really understand it. Putting the material into your own words ensures that you fully understand the information that you are sharing with us. It also helps perhaps put the ideas into a context and in a manner that the reader will be able to understand even better than the original source did. Especially if you're using any kind of medical or scientific kind of sources, those can be pretty high level academia. And I mean, we're all pretty smart here, but we don't need to be up there for this paper, right? You take the information that's up here at this level and take it word for word, use a direct quote into your paper, it's not going to sound like you. It's not, but if you take it and you put it in your own words, then you bring that information down here to our level, right? Still smart, but we don't need to be this level in the paper, right? So you'd still have to explain the direct quote anyway. You can't just provide a quote and then move on to something different. You always have to follow up on source information and connect it to your main ideas. So why not just try to put it in your own words to begin with? And save those direct quotes for source information that truly deserve to be quoted word for word. All right. So to write a summary or paraphrase, because, okay, I'm telling you that's what you need to use mostly in your paper. How do you do it? So the first thing you want to do is read and reread your source until you understand exactly what it is saying. I mean, even if you're going to use a direct quote, again, you need to fully understand the information that you are using from that source, right? Otherwise, what's the point? How do you even know you're using it correctly, or that it's saying what you think it's saying? Does it really fit in with the main point you're making in the essay? If you don't fully understand it, you're not necessarily going to use it correctly, no matter if it's summary, paraphrase, or direct quote. But especially if you're going to be putting something in your own words, you need to fully understand it. So read it and reread it. Then kind of jot down the relevant information, the main ideas, if you're doing a summary, or the main idea of that small little section if you're doing a paraphrase. Just jot it down. Then, without looking at the source, without looking at the notes that you jotted down, try to rewrite the information in your own words. As long as what you say, what you write, means the same thing as the original source material, you're fine. You're going to try to say the same thing in a new and different way. Try to do it without looking at the source. But that's why it's important to fully understand the source material so that you can think about it on your own and put it in your own words. Remember, you're not including any commentary or opinions or thoughts when you give the summary or paraphrase. That happens afterwards when you follow up on it. If you are simply explaining what a source said, then that's all you're doing, right? You need to introduce the summary or paraphrase, like, research shows that, blah, blah, blah. Then you give the source information and then you provide your citation, right? Or according to Dr. So-and-so, and then you give the source information. You want to introduce, right? Introduce the source. And you don't necessarily have to do it by name. What we mean by introduce the source is simply let the reader know in some way that the information you're about to share came from a source, okay? Then provide the information from the source, whether it's summary, paraphrase, right? And then give your own ideas afterwards. Follow up on it to show the significance of that summary or paraphrase. Why did you just share that information with us? How is it relevant to the point you're making at that spot in the essay? Connect it for us. Explain and connect. Remember, you don't want your reader to be confused, though, as to which especially if you're using summary and paraphrase, because we don't have quotation marks to clearly say this is what came from the source. When you're doing a summary and paraphrase and putting it in your own words and then following up on that information, you don't want the reader to get confused about where the source information ends and your ideas begin. So that's why you always have to provide the citation, the part in parentheses, immediately after the summary or paraphrase. Then go into your explanation and making connections. Okay? And remember, failing to cite those sources, whether it's summary, paraphrase, or direct quote, no matter how you use information from a source, you have to provide those citations where it's considered plagiarism. Even if the citation is wrong, we can fix that pretty easily. If it's wrong, it's not plagiarism. It's just not properly formatted. But if you took my advice from last week's lessons and did the reference entries first, then the citation should be correct. But even if it's not, at the very least, do what you can to cite it so that it's not plagiarism, right? Now, students usually struggle with the paraphrasing the most, because if you're taking, again, a 3-page article and summarizing it, it's going to be difficult to copy anything. It's going to be difficult to commit lesser known acts of plagiarism. The only thing that you might mess up on is maybe including too much detail when a summary is supposed to just focus on the overall main ideas, right? But for the most part, students use paraphrases the most and struggle with them the most. Because even if you can put the information into your own words, a lot of times we still copy the original author's sentence style and tone. And that's plagiarism also. If you're going to paraphrase someone else's words, you have to fully change it. So in order to get better at that, there is a 4-step process I'm going to share with you. This is for creating acceptable paraphrases. This is a good technique to use if all of this is very new to you, or if you've done research papers in the past and you're just now hearing that it needs to be completely different, not just changing some wording, then you might want to practice with this technique in order to make sure that you have good paraphrases. So the first step to paraphrasing is to translate. Translate the passage into your own words. Don't use a thesaurus. That's not going to work. But state the idea the way you would state it, right? So we have an example here. It's from Gettysburg Address. So our original source material says, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So this original passage here is from the Gettysburg Address, and we actually want to incorporate that information into our essay, but we don't want to quote it. We want to paraphrase it. So the first thing we have to do is translate it. Go through each section and put it into different words. So 87 years ago becomes 87 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Our ancestors created the United States of America. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. So we took Lincoln's words right here, translated them. 87 years ago, our ancestors created the United States of America, founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. This is where most students stop. But this is not a good paraphrase yet. True, we have changed the wording, but it still follows the exact same structure as the original. So that's not good. We have to make it different, completely different. So step 2 is to flip it. So here was our translated version. 87 years ago, our ancestors created the United States of America, founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. We're going to flip the order of the thoughts. Freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America was founded by our ancestors 87 years ago. So not only do we now have different wording than the original, we have different structure than the original. It's a little awkward. Maybe at some point we would come back and try to, work on it a little bit so that it doesn't sound so odd. But hey, it's better for it to sound a little odd than to be plagiarized. Because again, even though we changed all the words here, this is still plagiarism. This version is not, because the wording is different and the structure is different. So once we have translated it and flipped it, the next step, step 3, is to provide the signal phrase. Add a signal phrase which introduces the source before the paraphrase or before the quote or summary. In this case, we're doing paraphrases, but even when you're using summaries and direct quotes, you still want to introduce the source. A signal phrase lets the reader know that you are introducing source information, and that the signal phrase might even include information about the source. The signal phrase might include the author's name. The signal phrase might include the author's name and the year, right? So here was our flipped version, right? Freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America was founded by our ancestors 87 years ago. So this part that's highlighted in yellow is the signal phrase we've added. When Abraham Lincoln spoke at the 1863 dedication of a cemetery for Union soldiers at Gettysburg, he began by saying that freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America has been founded by the listener's ancestors 87 years before. So, this is our signal phrase. What's the last thing that we need to do? We need to provide the citation and then our commentary, our follow-up. So, right, here was what we ended up with last time in step 3. So now we're going to add our citation and commentary. That's the part that's highlighted in yellow here at the end. Our signal phrase, remember up here, our signal phrase came at the beginning. So the beginning was highlighted. Our citation and commentary are coming at the end. So now the end is highlighted. So when Abraham Lincoln spoke at the 1863 dedication of a cemetery for Union soldiers at Gettysburg, he began by saying that freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America had been founded by the listener's ancestors 87 years before. There's our citation, Lincoln, 1863. Lincoln may have been right about our country's noble beginnings, but it is clear that the ideals of freedom and equality have not yet come to fruition in the United States. So why are we even bothering to include this source information, this passage from the Gettysburg Address? Here's where we explain it. Here's where we follow up on it. So, 4-step process. Translate it, flip it, signal it, cite it, and commentate on it. So, try that process. Hopefully, you'll start to get the hang of it and you won't need to be so structured in how you create the paraphrase. But I do think it's a good technique to use, especially if you are not familiar with writing research papers. If it's not something that you've done in the recent past, or even if you have, if you have been given notes, or got docked points because your source information wasn't used effectively or correctly, then try this 4-step process. Because again, the majority of your sources should be used in paraphrases. Those direct quotes should be used sparingly. So if you know that you need to be using paraphrases more than anything else, make sure you're doing it well. And I'm not saying that this is stellar, right? But it gets the job done, and it ensures that you have fully changed the original source material. Okay. Going back to that the 3rd step, including the signal phrase, introducing the source material. This slide right here offers some different and common verbs that can be used in signal phrases. Dr. Smith accepts that this method might not work for everyone. However, blah, blah, blah. So we've got contradicts, identifies, shares, asserts, denies, outlines, supports, concludes. And these are how you would let us know that the information is coming from a source. Again, so-and-so explains that blah, blah, blah. Or research suggests that blah, 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 right? So these are the different kinds of verbs that are commonly used to do that. So come back to this slide if you need to. Try to get a variety of signal phrases, of verbs going on, but make sure you're using them in the correct context. You don't want to say that so-and-so contradicts something if that's not actually what they're doing. Contradicting is saying that something is the opposite of what someone else says, right? You don't want to use the word rejects as your verb if that's not really what the source is doing, right? So keep that in mind. But as long as you're using the verbs in the correct context, then, try to vary which ones you use. Try not to use, suggests or claims every single time. Those are probably the 2 most common, right? All right, so as stated earlier, you're going to want to use more summary and paraphrase than direct quotes. But sometimes quoting is the best option. So some good reasons why a direct quote might be the better option is that the source author has made a point so clearly, so concisely, that it, it would actually be worse to try to put it in your own words. It really can't be expressed more clearly and concisely. Maybe a certain phrase or sentence in the source is particularly vivid or striking, or just encapsulates something so well that you're discussing. Maybe then a direct quote would work best. Maybe an important passage of the source information is kind of difficult, right? Maybe it's got some pretty complex terms or ideas being discussed, and sometimes it's better to provide that direct quote and then explain what the original author was saying. You still have to then commentate on it, right? So if it's a really complicated direct quote, you have to take an extra step before you follow up on it and connect it back to your own main point. You have to actually explain it then, literally, so the reader will understand the quote, right? Sometimes, you'll want to use a direct quote if you are making a claim that the reader might doubt. Like if you're criticizing or disagreeing with a source, your reader wants to feel sure you aren't misrepresenting the source. So giving the direct quote will let the reader know, oh yeah, that is what this source says, and the author of this essay is disagreeing with that. Sometimes a direct quote works there. But again, for the most part, summary and paraphrase. But if you're going to use a direct quote, you want to keep the following in mind. Always have a good reason for using a direct quote. Otherwise, use summary or paraphrase. I really can't say it enough. Do not allow direct quotes to speak for themselves. You have to follow up with an analysis or making a connection. The quote itself isn't enough. You're the only one that's read the source so far. So if you're going to give a direct quote from it, you have to follow up on it. Always. Always, always, always. Don't use quotes as padding or just for the heck of it. And only take out the word for word parts that need quoting. I've seen a lot of times where students are using a direct quote from one of their sources and they quote like 3 or 4 full sentences. Maybe not that many. But still they quote like, 2, maybe 3 full sentences, when what they really only needed was maybe one of those sentences, or maybe even part of the first sentence, a little bit of the second sentence, and a little bit of the third sentence. There's a way that you can do that, where you can direct quote just segments, right? Without having to bog us down with 3 full sentences of a direct quote when only 30% of it is relevant. Only 30% of it is what you actually want us to focus on. So only use the word for word parts that are necessary. And it does not have to be full sentences. We're going to take a look at how you do that here in just a moment. Try to avoid wordy or awkward introductions to a quote, right? Because just like when we paraphrased, step 3 was adding the signal phrase to introduce the source material. You do that with a quote also. The only difference is that you're going to end up with quotation marks and word for word instead of putting it into your own words. But you still have to provide the signal phrase to introduce the source material, to introduce the quote. So we have an example here. It says, in Simone de Beauvoir's 2014 article, The Coming of Age, on page 65, she states, the decrepitude accompanying old age is an incomplete conflict with the manly or womanly ideal cherished by the young and fully grown. That beginning part is really kind of wordy. In Simone de Beauvoir's 2014 article, The Coming of Age, on page 65, she states, no, try this instead. In The Coming of Age, Simone de Beauvoir contends that the decrepitude accompanying old age is in complete conflict with the manly or womanly ideal cherished by the young and fully grown. Then give the citation of the year. Sometimes it works to include the author's name and the year as you introduce the source information, but that's why we have citations, is so that you don't always have to do that, so that you don't have to create these super wordy, awkward signal phrases. You know, you don't sometimes you don't have to include the author or the year at all, right? Because that's what the citation is there for. Use it to your advantage to make the signal phrase read more smoothly, right? More clearly. Right. Another thing is, again, choose your introductory and signal phrase verb carefully. Right? So if you want to use a neutral verb, try using verbs in your signal phrase like writes, says, states, observes, suggests, remarks. That doesn't give any indication as to if it's positive or negative, if you agree or disagree, if it's just this is what was said in that source. If you want to convey an attitude or an emotion about the source information, you can use verbs such as laments or protests, charges, replies, admits, claims, right? But again, just make sure that you're understanding the context of each verb as you create your signal phrases. Combine direct quotes with a paraphrase, right? So our original here says, Tanya Modleski suggests that, and then we have a direct quote. If television is considered by some to be a vast wasteland, soap operas are thought to be the least nourishing spot in the desert. So how about, in her critique of soap operas, Tanya Modleski argues that some view television as then a vast wasteland, end quote, and soap operas as the least nourishing spot in the desert. So part of the original was paraphrased, part of the original was taken with direct quote. You still provide the citation, so you're covered for both, right? You don't have to quote all of it. Sometimes you can just use a few words of a quote for effect. So here's our example. A recent study of student plagiarism found that plagiarism is often a, quote, matter of confusion rather than deception, end quote. Okay, how about, as William Neal suggests, some humans have a moral deafness which is never punctured no matter what the moral treatment. So in our first version, we took matter of confusion rather than deception instead of the whole sentence. In our second example, we took two words, moral deafness, right? Because that's the only part that we really needed to bring over word for word. There's not much else, we could think of another way to describe moral deafness, but that's such a cool term. Why not just take out and quote that term? We can paraphrase the rest, right? We only need to directly quote the essential elements of that section, not all of it. All right. Rules for punctuating quotes. It's not really punctuating, it's more formatting. Short quotations. If your quotations are less than 4 lines long, 4 lines of text in your essay, which is usually the case, less than 4 lines, you place them in your text just like we're used to and close them with quotation marks, right? Give the parenthetical citation, the in-text citation, but that's how we probably are used to seeing quotes being given. How, if we've done them before in a research paper, it's probably how we did it. It just gets incorporated right into your paragraph. And the quotation marks is what lets your reader know that it was taken word for word from the source. If by chance you come across a longer quotation that you really think needs to be included in your essay, and by longer we mean more than 40 words. If it's more than 40 words, it needs to be blocked, right? So it'll look like it's in the center of the paragraph or of the page, the whole thing. You don't tab over in the beginning, it's just one block right in the middle. If it's 40 words or more. You're going to introduce the quote in the paragraph above, right? At the end of that paragraph, you'll say, according to so-and-so, right? And a colon. And then you'll come and provide the direct quote in block form. And then you'll follow up on it. You won't start a new paragraph underneath it. It'll still come out to the left-hand side, and because it's still a continuation of that paragraph up there. Just like in a short quote, right? You start the paragraph, then you give the direct quote, then you follow up on the quote, all in the same paragraph. Same idea here. You've got your paragraph, you introduce the quote, but it's a long quote, so it's blocked, and then the paragraph continues underneath it where you explain and analyze the direct quote. Ellipses are used in that situation I mentioned earlier about if you're only taking, like, say you've got 3 sentences from your source and it's like, I really want to quote this part and this part and this part, but not the whole full 3 sentences. Then just quote those 3 parts. Start with the double quote where your first words appear. Maybe it's 3 words, right? And then an ellipsis, ... and then the next set of words that you're quoting, and then ... and then the last set of words you're quoting, and then you end the quotation marks. The example here, it says, even to take drugs once or twice, Diamond writes, I must be strong enough to get past ... the misery of my first hangover. This ... lets the reader know that obviously something came in between, something came right here, but it wasn't important or relevant enough for us to include it. So we skipped that part and then came back to the end of the quote. Okay. Okay. So in review, knowing how to effectively integrate source material is super important because you want it to flow. You want it to fit right in with your own ideas, your own writing. There's typically 3 ways: summary, paraphrase, direct quote, that you can incorporate source information. You're going to want to try to use summary and paraphrase the most, and using direct quotes sparingly. Most of the time, it's actually going to be mostly paraphrase, maybe some summary, but mostly paraphrase. Direct quotes sparingly. Use the 4-step process explained in the slides here to help you create acceptable paraphrases. Remember all the tips here for choosing and integrating direct quotes if you feel the need to use one. And always remember to cite any and all source material every time. Okay. Have any questions? Let me know. Especially when you get to this week's homework, which is all about practicing integrating sources. But again, come back to these slides first and see if the information here can help you with the assignment. And if you're still struggling, by all means, reach out. If you have any questions at all about how to use source material, if you want more practice, I can give you some extra resources and whatnot. But remember, it's all a process. So try to incorporate your source material as effectively as you can. try to integrate it as smoothly as you can. And we can work on it. Okay? All right. You are free to move on to the next thing.